I'm a director in the Pacific Department at ADB in Manila, and I'm your chair for this session. We've got a number of panellists who will be talking on the topic of disaster response and risk reduction. Bulk of them sitting so they can see the slides, and with me is Megan Chisholm from CARE, who'll be the first speaker. But just a few words to sort of give some context for this session. Clearly, being here in the Pacific, you'd all be aware that Pacific countries are very, very prone to natural disasters. Pacific countries frequently appear in the sort of top 10 lists of most disaster-prone countries. Vanuatu in particular comes near the top of the list, if not the top of the list in the world. So it's a very pertinent issue we're talking about this afternoon. What sort of experience over the years has shown is that sound risk reduction activities, for example, climate proofing of infrastructure, appropriate policies and plans, community awareness and training, all help to put countries in a better position to respond post-disasters by creating less problems to begin with. But also faster, well-targeted responses does help to minimise the medium to long-term social, financial and economic impacts of disasters. Hence, what we're talking about here is important for both economic and financial reasons as well as social reasons. At last year's Pacific Update conference, one of my colleagues shared our intent to support a contingent credit line for the Cook Islands, which I'm pleased to say we had approved by our board last December. That means we'd worked with the Cook Islands to improve their disaster risk management activities, and we provide a $10 million US credit line that they can draw upon in the case of disasters to respond to those disasters. So this year, I can tell you that we're working on expanding that and looking at a regional approach across 5 countries, which are some of the most disaster-prone countries in the Pacific, and we'll pilot it there and look to expanding. Similar thing, working with the countries to improve their disaster risk reduction activities and their disaster risk management, and providing, in this case, a contingent savings facility that countries can draw down upon in the event of disasters, and help to do some of the many things that the people here on this afternoon's panel will be talking about. So if I can begin, our first speaker will be Megan Chisholm, who is the Country Director of CARE International in Vanuatu. She's going to pose the question, does community-based disaster risk reduction make a difference in the face of a Category 5 cyclone? Something clearly that the experience in Vanuatu will allow her to answer. So Megan, if you'd like to go ahead.
How about that? Yes, that's better. Okay, thanks for joining, and it's the afternoon session, so it's always a difficult one. Does disaster risk reduction work, and specifically gender-responsive, community-based disaster risk reduction? The problem with disaster risk reduction is that it's really hard to prove success, because success is when a disaster doesn't happen. So it's got that reverse logic. If you've been successful, nothing happens, so it's very difficult to show the evidence that it works. So particularly in the area of disaster risk reduction, I think we're often challenged in terms of our evidence and in terms of the monitoring and evaluation systems and tools that we use in order to really prove what the impact of our programs are in terms of community-based disaster risk reduction. So it's a challenge for the sector in general. When Cyclone Pam hit, I expect everybody in this room is quite familiar with Cyclone Pam. It was a Category 5 cyclone with the strongest winds that had ever been recorded in the Pacific, and it affected 80% of Vanuatu's population and had a devastating impact on the communities that were affected and the nation as a whole. So in Vanuatu, CARE had been working for a number of years on disaster risk reduction programs. So we work in the Tawhea province, which is the southernmost part of Vanuatu. And as you're aware, Vanuatu is one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world, not only the region but in the world. And the area that we work in Tawhea is extremely remote, isolated, culturally diverse, and there's high levels of gender inequality. So Cyclone Pam was, a tremendous disaster for the communities that were there, but it also provided a learning opportunity in terms of looking at how disaster risk reduction helped communities to prepare and to respond to that emergency. So CARE had been working since 2011 in Tawhea province on community-based disaster risk reduction, and specifically in two communities that I'm going to talk about, and on two islands of Aniwa and Erromango in Tawhea province, but we'd been working there since 2013. So that means we had 2 years of community-based disaster risk reduction programming that had happened on the ground when those communities then faced up against Category 5 Tropical Cyclone Pam. So after Cyclone Pam, we started to hear the stories from the communities and how they faced the cyclone and how what they'd learned during disaster risk reduction programming had made a difference. So we decided this was a good opportunity to try and test some of the theories that we'd applied in the disaster risk reduction programming and see if there was indeed more than anecdotal data, but some actual robust evidence that demonstrated the impact of disaster risk reduction. And that's the study that I'm going to talk about today. So to start with, CARE's program works with community disaster and climate change committees. And you heard in the previous session around the importance in the framework for resilient development that the integration of climate change and disasters is very key. So we work with communities that are integrating disaster management and climate change adaptation on the ground where they live. CARE's program involves facilitating risk assessment, community-based planning, training, simulations, provision of equipment, and a quite comprehensive and intensive investment in supporting community programming. We also focus on gender and social inclusion. So we place a very strong emphasis on supporting women's involvement and leadership in disaster risk reduction, supporting communities to ensure that women take leadership roles in the CDCCCs, the Community Disaster Committees, providing training for all community leaders on gender and social inclusion, and really putting that at the forefront of our disaster risk reduction approach. And I'll just say too, for the work that, the type of work we do at the community, the National Disaster Management Office has since put all of those tools and resources into a handbook and adopted that as a national approach to community-based disaster risk reduction. So that's this small handbook I've got here. So if anyone's interested in more, you can have a look at that later. So what we did to look at what evidence we had about how this did or didn't make a difference to communities affected by Cyclone Pam, we did a comparative study. So we approached one group as what you might call a treatment group, communities who had been part of CARE's disaster risk reduction programs, and they were communities on Erromango and Aniwa, with a control group, and they were communities on Tanna, who had not previously engaged in disaster risk reduction work, so they'd had no involvement in any disaster risk reduction programs prior to Cyclone Pam. Based on the three research questions we looked at then in those different communities was, how did the community actions differ before, during and after Tropical Cyclone Pam? What effect did those differences have on damage and recovery? And were there gender and social inclusion differences between the communities? We looked at a checklist that was based on the government's formal advice on what you should do during an emergency. So we used the Vanuatu government's disaster risk reduction checklist to look at what did the communities do in practice in the face of Cyclone Pam compared to the recommended actions from the government for disaster preparedness. And we looked at what they did at each stage of the alert. So you have 5 stages, 24 hours before, 12 hours before, red being during the cyclone, immediately after, and then in the recovery, initial recovery phase. So we used an independent consultant and a team of national staff who did key informant interviews, focus group discussions, transect walks, and used other participatory research methods with communities to look at what they did in the face of Cyclone Pam, and then scored them against this checklist, so that each community got a score at each phase of the alert. So, I'm going to work computer. Okay, so did the disaster risk reduction program make a difference? So these are the scores. Now there's something important I have to highlight for you because it's quite hard to see on this. The first column is the communities from Aniwa and the scores that they got. The second column in the graph, the light orange, is the communities on Erromango that had both participated in disaster risk reduction. The communities that hadn't participated in disaster risk reduction are the very pale orange, and I'm sorry you can't see it very well there, but if you see these tiny little scores in the third column on each one, are the communities with disaster risk reduction, who had not participated in disaster risk reduction. So what this tells us is that communities who had participated in disaster risk reduction programs achieved a score of between 70 to 100% across all five phases of the alert. So they did what they were supposed to do. They did exactly what the National Disaster Management Office recommended to them. The lowest score in the 70% related to not having enough food in some safe houses. But they prepared food, they got into safe houses, they had a committee established that was responding to the disaster, they secured their boats and their household supplies, they completed assessment forms. They did a textbook response to the emergency. The communities that had not been involved in DRR scored between 0 and 12% across every phase, which means they didn't do anything that they should have done, according to the NDMO handbook, because they just didn't know. So they weren't in safe houses, they were in their own homes, asleep in the middle of the cyclone. They hadn't prepared food. They had ran around in the middle of the cyclone as the houses blew down around them. So it was quite compelling results that even if you just look at it from a numeric perspective without getting into those stories, that the communities that had been through community-based disaster risk reduction training really did know what to do and were able to cope better with the cyclone. And so it's that we've got the numbers there, but it's really the human stories that I think illustrate it better. So I just want to tell you about two communities. So I'll give you an example. So Vanuatu is a community on Aniwa. They had a person who was chair of the CDC, the Community Disaster and Climate Change Committee, who coordinated the response. They had a female chairperson, and she handed out information about all of the alerts around the cyclone from her house. The community worked together, and they prepared things, and they moved into identified safe houses. They helped to move people with disability and vulnerable groups into safe houses. And then during the cyclone, they had CDC members who stayed on guard during the cyclone and monitored what damage was going on. The day after the emergency, they filled in completed assessment reports that followed the recommended format from the NDMO, and they sent that straight off, a full and completed initial rapid assessment, they sent that straight off to the Provincial Disaster Office. An example from Erromango that had been part of disaster risk reduction programs. In Dillon's Bay, there was 615 people who live in Dillon's Bay, and the community worked together again with the Community Disaster and Climate Change Committee to work out which houses were safest. They prepared food, they went to the gardens and harvested food, and then they also secured their boats. So they moved all of their boats inland and they weighted them down, and they then, stayed in the houses until they got through the cyclone, and then again did an assessment once the cyclone was finished. In the community on White Sands, the community received the alerts, but they didn't understand them. They didn't know what they meant. So category 5, is that good or bad? Is 1 high or is 5 high? They weren't sure what the strength meant. It's at J5 of the tracking map. Well, where's J5 or L2? Where is that? We don't know what that means. They also didn't believe them. They said, we haven't had a cyclone for a long time. We've had alerts before, so we don't actually believe the alerts. So they did nothing. Some women reported that they said, maybe we should go to the garden, and their husbands said, no, we're not going to have a cyclone. Don't bother preparing the food or harvesting anything from the garden. When the cyclone came, people went to bed in their own houses without having prepared their houses and without being in safe houses. So people went to sleep in their beds in their own family house. They weren't in safe houses, and the majority had not prepared their houses, although some started to tie down their roofs when the wind was already strong. The result was then that people were running around in the height of the cyclone, moving from house to house as the house blew down around them. So it was extremely dangerous. They didn't move their boats up. They lost all of their boats, and they had significant injuries. So there was a case, this is the community of YCC that I'm talking about. So they had a case of a boy being trapped under a fallen tree, a man speared with flying wood, and a woman and her child being lifted up and thrown into the trees behind them. And this was all from moving around during the time not only of the cyclone but a storm surge. So these were radically different experiences that these communities had depending on whether they had been through that training or not. So based on this, we think that it does make a very big difference to how communities experienced the cyclone. We can also look at the issue of damages. And so, one part of the question was how did disaster risk reduction make a difference to the actions that communities took? But the other part of the question was, how did it make a difference to the damages sustained? This is a much trickier one to answer. It's very difficult in terms of the evidence because the characteristics of the wind and the geography and the closeness to the cyclone are all variables that it's difficult to adjust for. However, we believe based on this study it's likely that the disaster risk reduction programs did help communities reduce their losses. So we say this on the basis of the fact that the storm, if you look at the storm path, it passed over Erromango, directly over the communities in Erromango that we worked with, and then it also passed over Tanna. So Tanna and Erromango both had very destructive winds, and Niwa had less destructive winds, which may have resulted in less damage. But the communities that had prepared had tied down their houses, had moved and secured their boats inland, had secured their personal items, sustained 59 to 81% of houses sustaining serious damage, compared to the communities that hadn't been in disaster risk reduction programs sustaining 94 to 96% in the two areas where there were very destructive winds. There were also lots of other stories about the damages that were minimised. So I mentioned the boats, that the communities that secured their boats were able to go fishing again straight away. The food, communities that had prepared and harvested food had food for 2 weeks after the cyclone. Communities that had not prepared food were eating fruit that had fallen off the ground and what they could salvage in the aftermath of the cyclone, which lasted about 2 days before they needed support from emergency relief. Similarly, around personal items and household items, there was a difference in those who had taken action to protect their assets and those who hadn't. The other, and also in terms of, we also looked at recovery. How had communities recovered? We found that communities in Aniwa felt that they were closer to being back to normal. Communities in Erromango were halfway back to normal, and this was partly a product of El Nino and the fact that after Cyclone Pam they were still very much suffering from El Nino, whereas the communities in Tanna felt that they were less close to recovery. But that's also exacerbated by the volcano having a greater impact on communities in recent years, exacerbated by loss of foliage after Cyclone Pam. The other aspect that we looked at was the gender and social inclusion aspects of the work and of how communities responded. What we found was that in communities where they had not participated in disaster risk reduction, households prepared and responded alone. So they use the term one house. So they prepared as a family in their household, not as a whole community. Women's concerns were not necessarily listened to, and women were not particularly involved in leadership and decision making. Vulnerable people, in particular people with disability, were cared for by their family and seen as a family responsibility. And it was quite clear when you talk to communities, and this is obviously something harder to measure, but that there was still a very strong sense of trauma around the cyclone at the time of the study. But what we found in communities that had been part of disaster risk reduction programs is that the community worked together as a whole. Because they had a community disaster committee where there were specific roles that men and women were part of, and the community had trained together, they prepared together and they responded together. So they came together in community safe houses, they looked out for other community members. Women and men shared roles, and women were confident, engaged in decision making and leadership. And, you know, the really interesting thing is that vulnerable people in the community were treated as a community responsibility. So where people needed extra support, the community provided that, as opposed to it being a responsibility for families. And the other intangible thing was that there was a definite sense of pride from communities about the way, when they talked about how they responded, there was a strong sense of pride about how they'd managed as a community. So so the conclusion of the report is that we do believe that the gender responsive disaster risk reduction helped to reduce the impact and the damage from Tropical Cyclone Pam, and that this provides evidence from that, and that it really transformed disaster management, the focus on gender and social inclusion, transformed disaster management from a household responsibility to a community responsibility, and particularly where men and women are both engaged in leadership roles and working together. In terms of some recommendations that came out of the study, disaster risk reduction should be an investment priority. It does work, and it makes a huge difference to communities that face disaster risk and climate risk all the time, particularly obviously in the Pacific. So we believe community-based disaster risk reduction must be an investment priority. It also needs long-term engagement. I haven't talked about this a lot, but you know, CARES programs for these communities was sustained support over a 2-year period. We did come across in some other communities, a community that might have had a one-off training in disaster risk reduction 5 or 6 years ago, and the evidence we saw, even though they're not included in this study, suggested that, you know, that was not effective and didn't make any difference. So one of the key findings is that it does involve long-term engagement with communities and a significant investment to empowering communities to manage disaster risks. It's really key to focus on trusted leaders in the community. So having those CDC members who were trusted leaders really helped people take on board the alerts and work together as a community. And those leaders, of course, must be both men and women, and that women's leadership is really critical. And so a focus on gender equality and inclusiveness provides a much stronger approach to community-based disaster risk reduction than one that doesn't. Finally, they were the recommendations. In terms of future research, one of the questions for us, I guess, still is around the sustainability in terms of, you know, I said we've been providing those communities in the study with 2 years of intensive support. And we believe it needs that kind of investment to be effective. So of course the immediate question is, okay, well, how long do you have to provide that investment for? At what point does it become sustainable? So that's a question that we've got on our table and on our minds, and something that we hope we can do future research into in the future. And I think I'm right on time, and I'll just mention that there are copies of the full report up the back, I think. If there's none left, then I've got a few more, if anybody's after a copy of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, for sharing those quite enlightening details of the data and the proof that you've collected that shows the real benefits coming out of gender-responsive disaster risk reduction at the community level. Now, our next presenter is Jesse Doyle. Jesse is a labour migration specialist at the World Bank, and this afternoon he too has a question. Does manna from heaven help? And he's looking at the role of cash transfers in disaster recovery, and in particular, lessons from Tropical Cyclone Winston here in Fiji. Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks to everyone for joining this afternoon. I'm going to be presenting the results from an impact evaluation that we carried out last year, looking at the impact of cash transfers provided by the government of Fiji in the wake of Tropical Cyclone Winston. I wrote the paper with a couple of co-authors at the bank, Alexia Vashenko, Jae-Kun Kim, and Jonathan Sibley, who unfortunately couldn't make it this afternoon. Tropical Cyclone Winston hit on February 20th last year. It was the most devastating cyclone to have hit the region. wind speeds of up to 285 kilometres per hour, 62% of the population impacted, and damage and losses of $1 billion US, or about 22% of gross domestic product. When you look at the path that the cyclone took through Fiji, it came across the Eastern Division and then almost cut directly through Vanuatu and Viti Levu, and on its way hit some of the poorest provinces in the country. Ra on the north coast of Viti Levu and Bua on the south coast of Vanuatu. And these were the provinces that formed the core of our sample for the impact evaluation. In terms of the timeline for the government's response, the first line of assistance from the government was really to open up the Fiji National Provident Fund for withdrawals. So on February 29th, the Provident Fund basically permitted members to take out $1,000 of their retirement savings and up to $5,000 for members who had proof of property title in an affected area. And that window was open for 60 days. Subsequent to that, on March 18th, the government put in an extra $20 million into their three core social protection programs: the Poverty Benefit Scheme, which is a poverty-targeted cash transfer, the Care and Protection Allowance, which is a child benefit scheme, and the Social Pension Scheme, which is basically a retirement scheme for those who aren't part of the Provident Fund. And these three programs formed the basis of our impact evaluation. Further down the line, on May 24th, they opened up a line of assistance which came to be known as the Help for Homes Initiative, and this was basically a housing voucher for households that were below an income earning capacity of $50,000 per year. We actually didn't really cover this in the evaluation because the surveys were carried out from June 7th to July 1st. So these were the three core programs that we focused on. As I mentioned before, the Poverty Benefit Scheme was the largest scheme, 23,000 households. And what the government did was provided an extra $600 for beneficiaries of that program as a lump sum transfer. For the other two programs, the Care and Protection Allowance and the Social Pension Scheme, a lump sum transfer of $300 was provided on March 18th, so about a month after the cyclone hit. The impact evaluation itself was funded through the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And what we did was adopted what's called a regression discontinuity design method. And basically that means that we took advantage of the fact that this poverty benefit scheme has a cutoff point. So if you want to become a beneficiary under the program, you basically nominate yourself as poor. A social welfare officer comes out to your house with a questionnaire which looks at the household assets you have and the demographic characteristics of the household. And then they put that into a database and it spits out a score. And if you're above that score, you miss out on the program. And if you're below the score, you become eligible for the scheme. So we took a sample that was 20% above this cutoff point and 20% below. And then we randomly selected taquinas from within that group, both inside and outside the affected areas. The impact evaluation component was confined to the poverty benefit scheme. And we took 275 households as the treatment group, so those that received the assistance, and they were in affected areas, and then 270 households as the control group. So those were households that had applied for the program, but were not eligible to receive the assistance. And basically what we wanted to do was to understand what the impacts of the top-up assistance were for those households that received it. Now, what's critical for any impact evaluation is that the baseline characteristics are the same between the treatment and control groups. And for our sample, this was indeed the case. Whether you were looking at their access to electricity, the number of rooms that they had in their dwelling, the age of the household head, or the cooking fuel that they used in the family kitchen. The shocks that they experienced in the wake of Tropical Cyclone Winston were also essentially the same. Looking at a range of different shocks from total loss of dwelling to damage incurred to the roofing to loss of livestock and loss of food stocks. So between those two sort of stylized facts, we had a really strong basis for teasing out the impacts of the top-up assistance. Market access is obviously critical when you're dealing with cash. And what we found was that before the cyclone hit, about 84% of households had regular access to a local market. And once Tropical Cyclone Winston hit, this went down to about 30% in the week after the cyclone. And then this was restored after about a month. So in terms of the timeliness of the top-up transfers, it almost worked out perfectly, because once this market access was restored, the payments were dispersed into the beneficiary accounts. This was on March 18th. And what we found was that 76% of households withdrew their payments within the first month of having received them. What was actually quite surprising was that the awareness of the top-up payments was fairly low. So only 47% of the beneficiaries were aware that the money would actually be coming into their account. And of that, a smaller fraction were aware of the actual intent of the payment. In terms of how long it took the households to actually spend the top-up cash transfers, over 75% had spent the transfers within 4 weeks of it having been dispersed to their account. So it goes to show that there was a real need for this assistance. A lot of households lost productive assets, and these are the types of things that they spent the assistance on. One surprising finding was that households who received the top-up cash transfers didn't really share them with other households or communities. And this was part of the rationale for providing assistance not just to affected areas, but also to non-affected areas, as the government thought that that money would flow through to their extended kinship networks in affected areas, and this simply didn't happen. So less than 10% of households actually shared the money that they received with other households. The money was spent on the right things. So over 99% was spent on what we termed as essential items, which were things like food, clothing, school supplies, medical supplies, household goods and products. Less than 1% was spent on non-essential items, so things like kava, cigarettes and alcohol. And this was a big fear for the government before the payments were dispersed, was that the money would essentially be wasted by the beneficiary households, and this simply wasn't the case. And as a result of the fact that the money was dispersed in a timely fashion and households spent the money on essential items for their recovery, what we found was that beneficiary households that received the assistance recovered far quicker from a range of different shocks. And we looked at things like their ability to repair their dwelling, repair their agricultural land, replenish their food stocks, and return to work. And across all of these different shocks, the households who received this top-up cash payment, which was relatively large in terms of the household income, $600 for the Poverty Benefit Scheme beneficiaries and $300 for the other schemes, it basically gave them a way to recover quicker than they otherwise would have been able to. So in conclusion, what we can say is that the intervention worked as intended. In fact, it worked spectacularly well. But moving forward, there are a number of lessons that came out of this evaluation. I think the first is that a better targeted information campaign is needed, so households know why this money is actually being sent out to them by the government. A second would be that it's critical to focus not just on poor households, but also on near poor households. So under this poverty benefit scheme, it's just the 10% of poorest households who receive assistance. But in effect, households that are above that poverty line, they are subject to the exact same set of shocks. And so they also need cash assistance from the government. And so it's critical to think about how we can build those databases so that the programs can scale up and cover not just the poor, but also the near poor. And then one final point would be, I think it's critical to look at the sequencing of in-kind and cash support. What we found was that market access was wiped out in this initial month after the cyclone, and so cash wouldn't have been an appropriate response for that first 4 weeks, but very quickly after households regained their access to markets, cash was a real powerful intervention. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse, for sharing the information on how the cash transfer went in Fiji. I'm sure that will be of interest to other governments, other organisations thinking of supporting similar in the wake of disasters in other Pacific countries. Our final speakers, and I say speakers because there's 3 of them, will be talking about talking on the topic of achieving a more appropriate and fit fit-for-purpose humanitarian disaster response ecosystem in the Pacific. I'll introduce all three up front. They might want to reintroduce themselves as they come up to talk. We have Susan Slattery from the Australian Red Cross, Linda Kenny, who is an independent researcher and formerly with the Pacific Institute for Public Policy, and Raylala Nakemba, who is an assistant professor at the Fiji National University. So Susan, I'll ask you to talk first.
A bit shorter, thanks. Hi everyone. Thanks for having us. Just want to thank USP, ADB and ANU for allowing us to come and talk about our research today. We're excited to be here, and we are going to be playing tag team throughout our presentation, so we'll try and be swift. So just apologies for the mouthful that is the title there, but looking at achieving a more appropriate fit-for-purpose humanitarian ecosystem in the Pacific. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about what the drivers for the research were. Australian Red Cross, which is where I'm from, early last year, did a literature review around localization. So that's a term that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and if not, then it will become part of your daily language very shortly. That was in the lead up to the World Humanitarian Summit, which was in May of 2016. Basically, the literature review showed that there was a huge number of issues, there's a wide variety of them, that there was we had little evidence around what localization was and how we could do it, but there were a huge number of aspirations that essentially we wanted to do it, we just weren't quite sure what it meant, beyond what we were already doing. Another key driver was the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain, which was the agreement that came out of the World Humanitarian Summit. Essentially, there's a whole host of things that are part of that, but essentially what that said was that there was a need to reform the humanitarian system, and a high priority was placed on localising humanitarian response. And a really key part of that was commitment from donors and actors to make that work, for us to understand what that is and how that can work. Another key driver for the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement is our structure. Localisation, or the structure of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, we're 190 independent organisations globally supported by the Secretariat of the International Federation of the Red Cross, and with the other part of our movement being the International Committee of the Red Cross. In humanitarian response, we have local, national and international responsibilities and a whole structure set up around what we do in humanitarian response. Essentially, localising humanitarian response is part of what we do. It's the way that we operate, but we know that we can do it better, and so that's what we wanted to try and understand through this research. And lastly, but certainly by no means the least, the Pacific is a really key focus area for the Australian Red Cross. In order to understand what that localisation looks like and what that means, Australian Red Cross really wanted to hear from the Pacific what it means to them, to national societies across the Pacific, and how we can be better partners in that process. Which leads me to our research itself. So the research is being conducted by a consortium, the Deakin University's Centre for Humanitarian Leadership, Fiji National University and the Humanitarian Advisory Group, and 4 are researchers who are from the countries within which the research is being conducted. And those countries are Fiji, Vanuatu, Tonga and PNG. And so you'll hear from 2 of those researchers in just a moment. The key question that the research asks is, what would a successfully localised disaster management ecosystem in the Pacific look like? And what changes to the Red Cross and the broader humanitarian system need to make it get there, need to be made to get there? It's quite a mouthful, so apologies. What next? So at the moment, basically where we're up to is the research is currently being undertaken. It's close to being finalised. So Raylala and Linda will give you a bit of an overview of where things are up to now. But essentially we're putting out regular updates, the first of which is here. I have a few copies, I'll pop them up the back if anyone's interested, or I can email them to you if you would like one. It's an insight paper. The research findings themselves will be available in mid-July, so some of the data analysis is happening literally as we speak in Melbourne with the Humanitarian Advisory Group. From that, Australian Red Cross will be able to assess, what does need to change in order to improve support to localisation. So culturally, leadership-wise, practice, in the way that we practice and any systems. So the findings will inform an organisational policy for Australian Red Cross, and we anticipate that the findings will have a broader implication across the sector. There will be obviously Australian Red Cross and also our national societies and federation partners. It will help us to find or figure out what our advocacy position is, so hearing directly from our partners in the Pacific about what we should be doing to support that process. And it will, in general, build on the research which is being undertaken globally. So this will obviously be specific to the Pacific, but it will help create that comprehensive picture of localisation around the world. So that's my part. I'm going to ask Relala to come up, and we'll do a quick tag.
Good afternoon, all. I'm just going to continue from what was presented earlier on the importance of localization. And based on this question, why localization is important, reflections and observations from both Fiji and Vanuatu will be presented this afternoon. Importance to know, so important to know about the approach that we took in this research. The brancherous diagram that you can see on the slide above here above you are the very rational and advantages that we took, or approach that we took on this approach, or on this research. Again, I would ask, somebody would ask why we took this approach, because it is more appropriate in the Pacific context, more cost efficient and more cost effective, and encourages more local dialogues, like the focus group discussion or the similar Talano sessions that has been constantly used across the spectrum for research. Some of the research tools that we have adopted or we have used in this process includes the key informants interviews for INGOs or NGOs with the government sectors, the focus group discussions, and visioning exercises, a couple of storytelling and case studies that also helped us in retrieving information or data from the field. The research process that we undertake in this research, the general, I could say that this is just the general research or the process that was undertaken by the team. First, the team sat in Suva way back in January for a one-week workshop to undergo the methodology or the methods to be undertaken in this research. So that includes the local representatives from PNG, from Tonga, Vanuatu, IFRC was also invited, Fiji Red Cross. So that helped us to define the problem. With all the inputs from national representatives, we were able to write or draft the terms of reference for localization. And again, the second phase that we did was the review of the literature, and it was presented earlier on. And based on those national documents and the diverse resources that the team were able to access, we were able to come up with the literature. And thirdly, the third phase, the designing of the methodology. Designing of the methodology was basically to test the methodology or the tools that we have decided to use in the study. Like I mentioned earlier, the key informants interview, the visioning exercises, and based on the designing of the methodology, we included teams from our own team, our research team, and also the team from the Fiji Red Cross, from the IFRC, to be part of our designing team. And as it was indicated earlier, that the research is currently ongoing, so some of the information gathering is still ongoing, and we are in the process of summing up the research, and we'll come to the next phase, which is interpretation of results and information or data that was collected from the 4 countries. And based on the localization, based on that workshop, based on what we had designed, the design methodology workshop that took place in Suva, we were able to demarcate our roles for all the researchers that were there, and part of our clearance, or part of the designing of our research is to get clearance for human ethics, or local clearance requirements. And what you can see also on the slide are it's not a refined definition of localization, but at the end of that week, we were able to come up with a definition of localization, which is basically what some of the organization, or some of the national, or some of the NGOs and INGOs, or even government bodies or government departments or institutions are currently practicing. A process of recognizing or respecting the strengthening and local leadership and decision making by national actors. As it is, it's like I said, it's not refined. The definition of localization is not refined. Most probably by the end of this research, or by the duration of this research project, it will be defined to the satisfaction of the Red Cross, ARC. Thank you.
So my task here now is to give you the perspective or reflections on what people were telling us when we were interviewing them. Interviewing them on what they think localization is to them. There were many of the different things that were coming out from our interviews. They were giving a lot of different things they think that should be what localization is to them, but I'm just going to go briefly through some of the things the common things that were coming out. One being that having the capacity in place. So realizing one of the things that was coming out from people who were interviewing was realizing that the government and the people at the national and local community level have the capacity, and that they should lead more, and that the leading from the INGOs should be less, but also that needing the INGOs to support them where there is gap, so to build up the capacity where there is gap, so government and the people can take up the responsibility to better respond in time of disasters. The other thing also, the other point that was coming out also was leadership and decision making, that there should be more of that coming from the government and the local people instead of the international actors or humanitarian actors. Another thing that was coming out from people who were interviewing was that there should be better coordination with the government, and that respect should be given to the institutions who were carrying out the response at that time. Another one was building up capacity, that where there are gaps, that people should, that the people's capacity should be built at the national and also at the local level, so they can be empowered to respond better to any disaster at the recovery stage and also at the rehabilitation stage. Another thing that came out was that the INGOs to learn more about the people and about their culture and their priorities. Sometimes when they go in during the response, that they just go in with whatever they think is suited for the people, and at times it's not always what the people needed at that time, so that there should be a learning, there should be more learning between the two, the people and their culture, between the INGOs, people from the community also learning about what the INGOs are doing. So just to go through again, when we were collecting the information, we were using KII and the visioning exercise. Visioning exercise is where we were asking people what they want to see change, and those specific changes, how they're going to bring that about, and so that we can have a more localized humanitarian response or action in the Pacific. So I think just to summarize all is just to realize that the people and the government, they have that capacity, and where there is no capacity, that it should be supported, and that can be supported through the INGOs that we have, local humanitarian people, actors on the ground, realizing that there are some capacities also that should be built, and that leadership and decision making are made by the locals, and that they should be respected, and not to always rely on knowledge or whatever is coming from outside, because already people have that knowledge, and that can be supported through different programs, and one being that CDCs, that the NTMO in Vanuatu are doing, the clusters that are being supported by the government and the NGOs, and that's a good way of how we can see people working together to respond to any disaster in the humanitarian action or response. Thank you.
So thank you, Linda, Ray, Lara and Susan. If you could come up the front, I'll open the floor at this point to any questions you may have. I have a few questions coming to mind, but I would much rather hear from you, the audience, and you've stayed here till 5 o'clock, by which I'm very impressed. So please put up your hand if you have a question. We have one brave soul. Tess, thank you.
Hi, I'm Tess Newton-Kane. I'm with the Development Policy Centre at the ANU. Jessie, thank you for that. I now know more about cash transfers than I did. You said that the government expected and possibly hoped that the money would move throughout the community using kinship networks, and that your study showed that that didn't happen. I guess my question is a kind of so what question. What does this mean in terms of government thinking for using a methodology of this type again? And you know, so what is the follow-on from that? Does it have any impact in what happens next, or is it just an interesting thing that we now know that we didn't know before? Thanks.
Thanks, Tess. That's a good question. I think the policy response is that, you know, it's basically important to geographically target these transfers. So before the response was sent out, there was a question as to whether you focus just on affected areas or whether you also channel that assistance to non-affected areas. And the decision was made to focus on both. And part of it was for the reason that I outlined, is that there was an expectation that it would be channeled through extended kinship networks. But a second sort of rationale was that it would stimulate the local economy. I think if you've got a budget, if you've got a sort of a fiscal cap, it's more effective to channel a higher level of assistance to those households that need it most, which are inevitably those in affected areas, rather than those on the other side of the country where the cyclone didn't hit. You know, ultimately it's a question for the government, and it's their decision. But the research that we've done, not just in Fiji but in other countries, shows that you can set these systems up to geographically target cash transfers, and that's the sort of needed policy response. Thanks.
Anyone else? Sorry, Scott, hook up the back there. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you, presenters, for what you've given us. It's very, very interesting and very good. First of all, for Megan for the first presentation. Thank you very much, Megan. I was just interested. You made that remark with regard to long-term engagement and being able to ensure that there's an uptake and a sort of, I guess, the knowledge being embedded into the communities. I'm aware that there's a UNDP-funded program called the Pacific Risk Resilience Program that operates in Vanuatu as well, and that's been operating for about the last 4 years. So I guess the thing is that, have you come across that program, I guess, is the first question. The second is that I know they've focused as well on community-based resilience building, and whether they have had whether you've seen any sort of similar sort of results with regard to the communities that they've worked in as well. The other, part B question is for Linda and her. Sorry, it's Louise. Is it Louise? The last presenters said it to Linda. Sorry, the last group presenters. Apologies for that. I haven't got my glasses on, and my vision is rapidly deteriorating as I get older. But the question I've got is that. I wanted to understand more clearly, when you're talking about the issue of localization, what is being localized, and what are you focusing on in terms of the study that needs to be undertaken by the communities? The reason why I ask this is that, my own research that I did like a decade ago now focused on local communities focusing upon natural resource management. For example, looking at the locally marine managed networks that operate in Fiji and other countries, and about how the local communities take that ownership going forward. So, there was identification of specific areas of what was actually being done with that localisation. So I'd appreciate to be able to understand, when you're talking about localisation of disaster risk reduction, what specific aspects are you talking about? How are the local communities identifying those particular areas that they think that they need to take leadership on? And how does that sort of complement, I guess, the work being done at the provincial or the subnational or national level going forward? Thank you for that. Sorry for the long questions.
That's okay. I'll pass to Megan, and then Linda and colleagues will decide.
Okay, is there anyone from UNDP here who might be able to answer that question better than me before I give you an answer? So I'm familiar with the PRRP program. They've got lots of different strategies, and one of the main strategies that I've come across is that they are directly funding positions embedded in the government. So one example I'll give you is CARE is the co-lead of the Gender and Protection Cluster, and we do a lot of work around gender and protection. We do that with the Department of Women's Affairs, and we work very closely with the Department of Women's Affairs, and they provide tremendous leadership and a lot of active work around the Gender and Protection Cluster. The position in the Department of Women's Affairs that leads on the Gender and Protection Cluster, and many people would know Rotina Illo because she's often in things. Her position, I believe, is funded by PRRP. So that's a good example of where that program is contributing to mainstreaming of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation within the government. In terms of community-based work, I am aware that the program did support some local area planning and community-based work, but from my knowledge of it, it was not intensive, and so not to the same extent that we're talking about, and was a little bit more in the short-term intervention that we would say needs some more work. I believe it was complicated may have tried to, I believe it was complicated by the fact that, Vanuatu is still developing its local area planning and bottom-up planning approaches, and so it's kind of linked to that. There are other organisations that are doing similar community-based work to what CARE's been doing now. So the French Red Cross, so CARE works in the Tafea province in the south, and the French Red Cross has been implementing very similar approaches in the north, in Torba province. And Oxfam now is also picking up and doing the same model in Sheffer. So as I said, a lot of organisations have worked together with the NDMO to translate those approaches into this national approach that's now been adopted as the national approach, and this is the NDMO's handbook. So a lot of stakeholders are now implementing this approach, which is now owned by the NDMO, in different areas. So there is a lot of work going on, but the PRRP approach, my knowledge of it is it's a bit different.
Hi, Susan. I'm Susan. That's okay. Thanks for your question, Scott. So I think a few of us are going to tackle the answer. But to start with, I think it's important for me to acknowledge that the research is for Australian Red Cross in order for us to understand what that means. So localisation, as these guys tried to pull together, or did pull together, a definition of what localisation means, and it can mean so many things. So the question of, are we talking about regional, national or local localisation? They're all things that are up for debate and part of the discussion more broadly. In this instance, we as Australian Red Cross are trying to understand how do we support our Pacific National Society partners, and what do we have to change about ourselves and the way that we operate in order to localise. And I think Railala is going to chat about the things themselves that will be localised. But I think the other really important thing for us to acknowledge, for Australian Red Cross and the Red Cross movement and more broadly the sector, is around we're talking about humanitarian response, but that also is around the development side of our work as well, so that humanitarian development nexus, and that both sides of that, or both ends of that spectrum, are mutually reinforcing, so that when we're not just exclusively talking about humanitarian response, I'm trying to understand in my daily practice what that means for me as a development practitioner in my work with Fiji Red Cross. I hope that goes some way to answering your question, but I might get Railala to...
In addition to that, when we were going around interviewing people, one of the common response they said, we're already practicing localization. So it goes back to the definition of what we are trying to get through in terms of what is really that we are trying to localize. We look at leadership, strengthening leadership in terms of capacity, whether it's at national level, whether it's the social structures in the community, whether it's a community level, or whether we need additional help from international NGOs. And the other example too that also received, or we understood from this, is coordination in terms of coordinating humanitarian response.
I think one of the, stop laughing, Anna. One of the main focus of this study was to see its own leadership and decision making, whether the locals are taking more lead in here or the internationals. So, and if the internationals are taking the lead, is it effective? If the locals are taking the lead, is it effective? So I think one of the focus was seeing the difference between how the international actors, humanitarian actors, were leading and making decisions compared if we were using the locals and the local government at the different levels, national and the community level, whether their decision making and leadership was more effective. I think that was one of the focus of this study. Thank you.
Hand up there in the middle, thanks.
Thank you for the presenters for their presentation. This is very much just a comment and sharing from our experience from Tonga, where we had, our organization had done a beneficiary validation exercise of the Cyclone EN in 2014, which a lot of the support is coming from World Bank. The interesting thing that we find in terms of relations to women was that in a situation like humanitarian, in response, a lot of our people don't really ask very much questions. They're at the recipient end, where they're just appreciating whatever it's been given to them without really asking any questions related to what is it really that they're right, that they're, you know, the human right perspective into humanitarian was one of the key things that was identified from the study that we have been involved in. And the interesting thing is that we, when the World Bank and the government were developing the criteria for the selections of these families to have their houses rebuilt as part of the response, they miss out totally the land issue. It was not part of the vulnerability criteria. And when we went out to do the validation, that was when we realized that the women are totally being displaced with our tenuous system because they don't own land. So that was just a comment to the response that sometimes when we do survey study like this, we may be trying to localize, which I like the idea, but localization sometimes need us to look into deeper issue, such as land, that sometimes we just shy away from because it's just too tough. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment. I can just maybe add something there. I think, you know, to me, one of the points you highlight is the importance of that deep gender analysis, even in an emergency context. And so, you know, as I mentioned the example that we work very closely in Vanuatu with Department of Women's Affairs on the Gender and Protection Cluster, and we invest a lot in the work around preparedness and working with national level partners as well as provincial level partners on really understanding the complexity of gender and protection issues and how they come to the fore in an emergency. And it's just so critical because there are issues like, you know, land tenure that are very complex and deep, but really are critical in that moment of an emergency. And all stakeholders and governments and development partners and humanitarian partners need to be prepared to deal with that complexity in that rush of an emergency. So thank you for the comment.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder. Have we got any further questions? Running down towards the end of the day. So if we have no further takers to ask questions, we've got a great panel here. I'll take this opportunity to say thank you to the panellists for what was some really interesting presentations on research that's recently completed and ongoing. So I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I'll hand over to Prince for some housekeeping after we've given the panellists another round of thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma and all the panelists. Okay, so just one thing before you go home tonight, we're handing out this this pink evaluation forms. If you're a bit too tired to answer, just answer number 1, and that would be okay for us. If you're sure that you'll come back tomorrow, and we hopefully you will come back tomorrow, you can do this tomorrow. But if not, you think you're not sure whether you can come back tomorrow, just please answer this and hand it over to any of the student volunteers. And I think for that, we're hope to see you tomorrow morning. We're starting again at 8:30 for the registration. Thank you.